you take a look at my little Substack?
I did. I was actually looking forward to talking to you.
I was waiting for you to call up and say, no, don't come in after.
Why do you think that would be the response to that?
Just kidding.
When did you start the Humboldt Zag? Has this been recently? Because you have the other two, right? You have Truth Smack and then Abu Francis, which have been around for a while.
Yeah. So, do you want to start?
We're going right now.
Okay. So, I have some journalist friends, we sit around, talk shop sometimes, get a coffee, whatever, freelancers that are in the area. And we'll sit around and talk about, what story would you really like to do? What would you like to do? And we're talking, possible stories. And I once mentioned, one story I've always wanted to do is interview that guy that was charged with stabbing Josiah Lawson, Kyle Zoellner. It's like, it's been years, the years go by since that stabbing, and, you never see any stories about him. It's in fact, even at the height of the newsworthiness in 2017, 2018, 2019, the guy just never gave an interview. Nobody ever wrote about him. I thought, I wonder what life looks like from his point of view. And my journalist friends went, that would be great. Do that. So I start seeing if I can get a hold of the guy. So I'm like emailing and doing Facebook and putting out inquiries to people. Do you know this guy? Whatever. And eventually he responded through a Facebook message and said, yeah, I'll talk to you. I'm like, cool. So I proceeded to interview him about 20 times over the course of about 8 months. And so I collected all of this material, and I got documents that he was able to get from the discovery period of his own preliminary hearing and his own civil case, and kind of realized I had probably more information than anybody on the whole thing, And so one of my friends said, you got to go, let's talk to SF Gate, let's talk to Lost Coast Outpost, let's talk to North Coast Journal. I know all these people. This would be a great story for them. So I had a few coffees and lunches or whatever with various editors and stuff around, and nobody wanted the story. I was like, well, that's kind of hot politically. I don't know if we could do that. Or, nobody really cares about that anymore. And it was just like, we were kind of, my friends and I, my journalist friends and I were kind of like, really? Nobody's interested? So, in fact, it was kind of ironic. One of the editors said, boy, I'd like to read that story, but I'm not going to publish it. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe there is public interest. I don't know. So my friends say, do a Substack. Just publish it yourself. Why not? And so looking at what I already had going, the Truth Smack and Catholic Farmer, I thought, well, I'll just start something new. And I call it the Humboldt Zag. And that's a tribute to what you might call Zag journalism, which is kind of what I've done a lot of. My whole background was in alternative weeklies, like the San Diego Reader, LA Weekly, and that kind of stuff.
I'm not familiar with the term Zag. In terms
the other
of
half of zigzag. And as one of my editors once said, everybody's zigging on the story, you zag. It's a way to approach a story. And that has kind of always stuck with me. What's the zag on this,
And plays perfectly into this story that you're working on.
Yeah, exactly. The story that basically was not told. And the untold story, I don't know about you, but I think untold stories are pretty interesting because you haven't heard them and you want to know why.
Well, especially just a high-profile case like that. even if you think that you have your mind made up on what happened, to hear the other side, I think, is important. Just at a base level, you would want to hear both sides of the story, especially from a direct source who was involved.
Yeah.
To get that, I'm surprised. Well, I'm surprised and not surprised that people would turn that down.
Yeah. Well, so I wasn't expecting to do that, but I did then launch a new Substack, my third one, the Humboldt Zag. TheHumboldtZag.substack.com. Dedicated to untold stories, and we'll see what happens, right? So I start off with this Kyle Zoellner story, and I did 4 parts. So I don't know if you had a chance to look through that, but I did, I looked at kind of in a little bit in chronological order. It was kind of like what happened that night, because I had seen the dash cam videos from the police. So I knew exactly what had happened when Kyle Zoellner was arrested and sitting in the back of the car. And then he was put in jail, arrested and put in jail, and was needed to be arraigned or cut loose. It's like charge him or kick him. You have I don't know what it is, 72 hours. I don't know exactly how they clock that, and they came pretty close to not charging him at all. It was like you could actually, I have all these files and printouts and stuff. So, somebody's watching this and it's 2 p.m. on the day they have to charge him or kick him, and they haven't charged him. And it's like, everyone's like, is he going to be let go? And so he wasn't let go. He was charged. And when he was charged, he pleaded innocent. His attorney, he had 2 attorneys at that point. This is like within a week of the stabbing. He had the first attorney that helped him get through the up to the arraignment. And then he was bound over for a preliminary hearing, and he had a public defender, a second attorney. Both of those attorneys said, if you claim self-defense, you'll get out of here tomorrow. I mean, it was a crazy night. It was a party. People were drinking. Who knows what was going on? You were obviously beat up. That was the famous pictures of him with all, his eyes all bleeding and everything. So all you have to do is say you were defending yourself, and there's not a judge in the world that's going to charge you with anything. And they were right. I mean, I've covered self-defense. I've covered courts a fair amount. I remember a story back in San Diego where, a guy shot 2 guys in his yard, and he wasn't even arrested because he claimed immediately that he was just defending his property, and these guys looked thuggish and hazardous, and so, he shot him. So you can shoot guys dead in your front yard and say it's self-defense, and you don't even get arrested.
Yeah, I don't know if that still holds up today, especially in San Francisco.
Stand your ground laws wherever. I mean, it's pretty common that we hold self-defense sacred in this country. Okay. Maybe in San Francisco it's different. I don't know. But the point is that Kyle Zoellner refused to say he was defending himself. So I didn't do it. That meant he had to go into jail for 3 weeks awaiting a preliminary hearing instead of just walking out. So, I did a story of him being in jail, it's called a Part 2, The Innocent Man, and all of the details around this whole thing about pleading guilty or not.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. For people that aren't familiar with the story, Can you just do a brief overview of the timeline from your perspective?
Okay, well, the incident took place in April 15, 16. It was in the middle of the night of 2017. And this all happened about 6 months before we even moved here. So when we got here, justice for Josiah was everywhere, we're like, oh, what's that? That's interesting. On that night, it was a Good Friday night in Arcata, over on the edge where HSU is. There's like a a neighborhood. There's a West End road comes down. There's a bridge that goes across over to HSU there. There's a roundabout, and that's the end of Spear. So it's kind of like West End and Spear come to this terminus. And right there, they were having this party. And it was 3 a.m. Fight breaks out, and Josiah Lawson gets stabbed. Josiah Lawson was just a sophomore at HSU. He was the president of Brothers United, which was a basically people of color club. And he was kind of a rising star there. And it was a tragic event. And all hell broke loose that night. And I've heard the dash cameras and the police mics and stuff of what was going on. It was absolute mayhem that night. And they immediately arrested Kyle Zoellner. And there was 1 or 2 eyewitnesses who said, yeah, that's the guy right there. And he was even sitting on the curb. He had been beat up and kind of immobilized. He was in a daze. So he was taken to the squad car out on Spear in a daze, and he sat there in a daze for a couple hours while they tried to. So anyway, the unsolved homicide happened when in May, about 3 weeks later, the judge threw out the charges against Kyle Zoellner. He had had a number of witnesses get up there. It was all in all the papers. I had read all of this. It took place before I lived here, but I was reading and making copies and PDFs of this stuff. And so all these people who are like, 3 a.m, groggy from whatever they were ingesting, trying to describe what had happened in this fight. Another key element of the story was a knife was found. This knife was a 10-inch, it had a 6-inch blade to 4-inch handle. This kind of long steak knife thing was found under a car near the site where Josiah Lawson was stabbed. The police bagged it and said this might be or could be the murder weapon and sent it off for tests. At the preliminary hearing, the judge dismissed all the charges, and it was almost like a riot broke out. And the narrative had been growing ever since the incident that this was a hate crime, that Josiah Lawson was stabbed out of hate, that there was a racial element to it. And that narrative was pretty strong. When I first heard about the case, I assumed that Kyle Zoellner was some kind of skinhead. The way they painted him, that he was some kind of racist. But I came to find out that he's not. I mean, he was dating a Hispanic girl at the time. He's not associated with any kind of white power, white supremacist skinhead movement of any kind. He's just kind of a stoner video game player. Sits on his couch most of the time. But his day job was working in a kitchen for a catering company. And he possesses knives for that job. So when that kind of became known, it was like, oh, well, we don't know about where this knife came from, but it could have come from a guy who's a chef, it could have come from a catering kitchen or something. So there was we did a part of the story on the trail of the knife, all the things that are involved with trying to figure out blood analysis and DNA analysis and all this kind of stuff. So the 4 parts ran their course. I thought, well, I basically told Kyle Zoellner's story. I mean, if anybody cares, they can read what it was like for him to be arrested, jailed, and accused of being a white supremacist and demonized in a lot of ways by the community. Then I did a 5th part because I was able to access the grand jury transcripts. I can't say how I got them. That's revealing a source. but I can publish them. So I did a fifth part called Tales from the Grand Jury, which was the first time the transcripts from the grand jury had been described and reported on in any way. There had been rumors and rumors and rumors and rumors. And some of those rumors, for people who aren't familiar with the story, when Kyle Zoellner was let go 3 weeks or so after the stabbing, he was let go without prejudice, it's called legally, without prejudice, meaning that the case is still open. It could go any way. If a case is closed with prejudice, that means it's over. We've done it. So he was released without prejudice. He could be recharged at any time. And there was mounting pressure from a lot of parts of the community, especially those who were sympathetic with Black Lives Matter and the mistreatment of people of color by police and that whole thing coming out. They really wanted to see justice done, justice for Josiah. They wanted to see the cops do something, get somebody arrested, get somebody convicted. And so 2 years after it happened, the DA convened a grand jury. And I think the hope, if I understand prosecutors at all, I mean, the hope was that they could get a grand jury to indict Kyle Zoellner, and then they could take it to trial because they tried with a preliminary hearing and they hadn't. And preliminary hearing, legally speaking, is a probable cause hearing. It's very routine. It's a chance for a judge to say, yes, there's probable cause. Let's put this guy on trial. In Zoellner's case, he said the opposite. To many people's surprise. I don't think there is enough evidence here. It's really confusing. We don't really know what happened that night. We haven't tied this to Kyle Zoellner in any way. So bring me some more evidence. The DA held a grand jury proceeding, and the grand jury declined to indict Kyle Zoellner. And they had access to all the forensic evidence that the people at the judge at the preliminary hearing didn't have. So then, again, kind of hell broke loose. It was like people were saying, how in the world can they let this guy off? How in the world could a grand jury not indict him? And that question was kind of not answered because we don't exactly know what happened in the grand jury. It's if they don't indict, they kind of seal everything. And I had to do quite a bit of learning about grand juries. So that was of interest to me. I started off asking, hey, DA, can anyone in your office tell me about how grand juries work? And they're like, no. And I'm like, City of Arcata, can anybody help me with this grand jury thing? No. It's like nobody wanted to help me in any way. So I had to learn myself. So if the grand jury declines to indict, everything is sealed. And the understanding is this is an ongoing investigation. This is without prejudice. Kyle Zoellner can be recharged at any time. Of course, at this point in the legal process, the prosecutors have to have so much full, ironclad evidence to recharge, because if they're anything less than 100%, they automatically go charging a guy who's twice been let off, and that creates reasonable doubt immediately. If you had so much evidence, how come this guy wasn't charged or bound over to trial in the first place? So you've got to have every duck lined up if you're going to recharge. And 7 years later, Kyle has never been recharged. The last story, Tales of the Grand Jury, tries to get into some of the interesting stories that came out of the grand jury proceedings, things that were not part of the previous record. So, for instance, the coroner, the medical examiner, not the coroner, the medical examiner who did the autopsy spoke to the grand jury about what he found. We don't have a copy of the autopsy. In fact, last I was aware. I don't think even the Lawson family were given Josiah's autopsy.
Is that standard, or is that because it's
an
kind of
ongoing
ongoing?
investigation? And so I don't have a copy of the autopsy, but I do know what the guy told the grand jury about it. And one of the things that he said was that Josiah was stabbed 6 times. And there had been some rumors and talk and chatter about how many times he'd been stabbed. Was it multiple times? And then they're like, was it 2 times? So there's various reasons for these various narratives on how many times he was stabbed. But the narrative that he was stabbed 6 times repeatedly in a rapid succession really casts the whole incident in a different light in some ways than some people who are barely able to function swinging a knife at each other. It's like, what the heck was going on that night that someone would take that knife so frenetically at Josiah Lawson?
Do you think that that indicates a self-defense claim, or do you think that that is just indicative of the chaos?
Well, you don't want to get me started on what I think. I'm just telling you.
We'll get there.
No.
I'm very interested in what you think.
Another thing that was interesting was there were 2 witnesses to the grand jury that were kind of had nothing to do with the party. One of them we'll call Arcata Dad, and the other one we'll call Marysville Mom. Arcata Dad was, in fact, a kind of a known quantity because right when the preliminary hearing went down and Kyle was let go, Arcata Dad posted some comments on a Lost Coast Outpost story. And he basically said, Josiah Lawson attacked me like January before this party happened. And people were kind of like dissing the guy and arguing with him. And you can go back and you can see all these comments that were made at the time. But this guy, Arcata Dad, testified before the grand jury under oath. And he was brought in, and the way grand juries work is the grand jury can make some decisions about what they want to hear. The prosecutor tries to lay out his best case because the prosecution always wants to prosecute and win. Okay, that's what they're about. So he's got his idea. When I say he, I'm talking about the Deputy District Attorney Joel Buckingham, who ran the grand jury. But as a representative of the prosecution, he's laying out the best stuff he's got. And he's putting up the witnesses, the best witnesses he's got. But in the back of his mind, he knows that if the grand jury indicts, there's going to be a defense attorney along the way somewhere. And what will that defense attorney be bringing up if this goes to trial? And the grand jury should know about the existence of this exculpatory evidence in the very beginning. They should know who the defense might call. So even though he's not a defense attorney, he's playing both sides. He's even playing a little bit of the judge, explaining the law to the grand jury. So he's got to wear all these hats. There's no judge. There's no defense attorney. Only the prosecution is there at the grand jury. So he mentions this witness, Arcata Dad, as a possible witness that would eventually factor into the trial. Well, Arcata Dad said this, and he said this on his posts, and he said this to the grand jury. It was his birthday in January 2017. He's got a loud fraternity party up the street. And he's like, okay, I'm not going to bed. I'm going to kind of stand watch, make sure, my car doesn't get trashed and whatever. And so he's kind of staying up around midnight or later, and he hears a bunch of glass bottles being broken outside his house. So he kind of looking out, and he sees these people kind of coming towards his yard. And so he runs out, and he sees they've dumped a bunch of trash and some 6-pack or beer case boxes in his yard. And he's like, take your shit out of here, you guys, get out of here, And they turn and go, slowly I turn, step by step. They're coming for him. It's like, oh, he's like, oops. Now this guy has a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, but he hasn't worked out in a while. And he's like, oh man, what did I say? So he's like, I don't want any trouble. Just get out of here. And anyway, they attack him. This guy wallops him and he tackles the guy. And he puts him in some kind of jiu-jitsu hold so that he's like under him and he's got his arms in a vice and whatever. And other people come up and start hitting him. And a girl starts pulling on his hair and smacking him. And these other people are kind of weighing in a little bit. And he finally gets free of the thing. And there's a second round and he's getting beat up by these people. And the sirens are coming. The neighbor had called 911. So the sirens you start to hear the sirens. This little crew jumps in a car and drives off. So Arcata Dad files his report. And he looks through all the six-pack pictures they give him and he doesn't recognize anybody and the case just is done, you know. He was assaulted and there's no way of figuring it out. Fast forward to April. Suddenly he's seeing a picture of somebody all over the news. That's the guy that assaulted me, Josiah Lawson. That's the girl who assaulted me, Ren Bobadilla. That's the guy who was standing there watching, Elijah Chandler. So he comments and he tells the grand jury this. So people wonder, why did they allow somebody to come in and basically undermine Josiah Lawson's reputation, make him out to be some kind of a thug, make Elijah Chandler and Ren Bobadilla seem like kind of like street criminals? The reason is because a defense attorney would bring that up and try to show that Josiah Lawson had a history of violence. And that's not something that the community wants to hear. It's a fact. I've talked to other people that were not involved in the grand jury, and it's a fact. Josiah Lawson was kind of a hotshot. He had a temper. He was at a party and put someone's head through a glass window when they had gotten in a fight. I mean, not the kind of guy you want to mess with. And Arcata Dad told the grand jury all of this. Now, Marysville Mom. Marysville Mom is like the other side of the coin. Marysville Mom is this woman who's got this little toddler up in Marysville. This is over, inland, somewhere between Sacramento and Chico. And she's going to the park with her little toddler and doing the swings and stuff. And she meets other moms. And so she meets this other mom. And they have a couple of play dates in the park. And after the second play date, she's talking to this mom and they're walking down the street, going home or whatever, and they pass a black person on the street. And this woman says, this woman she had met, the Marysville mom says, the woman she had met, starts going off about how black people hate her. Black people hate me. Black Lives Matter people hate me. The cops hate me. Hell's Angels hate me. Everyone, they drove me out of Humboldt. So the Marysville mom's kind of like, okay, you want to go with that, So anyway, she gets this tale. The woman claims the woman's name was Casey Gleaton, and Casey Gleaton was one of the star witnesses in the preliminary hearing and also testified to the grand jury. Casey Gleaton was a friend of Kyle Zoellner and his girlfriend, Lila Ortega. Casey Gleaton was, I guess, her claim to fame in the whole Kyle Zoellner narrative was she's the one who said he might have a knife missing from his bag. That Lila Ortega, Kyle's girlfriend, said something about he's got a knife missing from his bag. And so the idea that there was a knife missing was something the cops wanted to jump on. It's like, okay, what's the missing knife? Is the missing knife the murder weapon? Whatever, they're going and they're getting search warrants and they're trying to figure this out. Casey Gleaton is the one that was staying at Kyle and Lila's house and said that Leila was concerned that a knife was missing. Well, Casey moves to Marysville after all of this is over and is telling this story to Marysville mom and says, yeah, and we got away with it. My friend and her boyfriend, we all got away with it. And one version of the story, which the police, Arcata Police went and interviewed Marysville mom because when she got home, she was pretty disturbed that this woman had told her that they got away with murder down in Humboldt at this party, stabbing some guy. So she calls and finds out that she's got to talk to Humboldt sheriff or something. Arcata Police go out, Detective Doc Weiler goes out and interviews him, and he testifies to the grand jury about what she said. And in his version of what she said, she added that Casey told her that she cleaned the knife off. Well, Casey gets up in front of the grand jury and says, no, I didn't. I barely met that lady. I don't know what she's talking about. I never said any of that stuff. Okay, so there you go. Everybody's lying. But it was an interesting story to open up, in a sense, suspicion about what Kyle Zoellner and Leila Ortega might be capable of. So that was the grand jury wanted to hear that story.
How did you infer that when you came across that? Did you think that there was some legitimacy to Maryville's mom, to her story? Or,
well, I
mean, it seems kind of crazy that she would just come out with that out of the blue. I could see if it was somebody in Humboldt maybe coming forward.
I think that one of the things you notice about this story, and it's probably true for any crime story, is everybody lies. And what I mean by that is everyone has a tendency to minimize what they were doing, right? So every witness gets up, and you can read the preliminary transcripts and you can read the grand jury transcripts, and everybody gets up, and they weren't drinking. They weren't doing no drugs. They weren't getting any fights. They were just watching all this stuff happen. And, somebody had a fight. Somebody was blitzed out of their minds. And somebody got killed. And of course, what happened. And of course, you had some role in it. And of course, you're not going to say that. So I think it's very frustrating and I put on sort of like if I were the police, I think it would be very frustrating to hear various variations on these stories and everyone kind of contradicting each other. But let me just say one thing about when you're approaching these various eyewitness reports, and of course, eyewitness reports are good and bad. You're a journalist, you cover a car wreck, and there's 10 people with 11 different versions of it. It's good and bad, but you try to look for convergence. You try to look to see, are multiple people saying the same thing? Or does the narrative based upon firsthand witnesses point in some direction? So one of the things that seems obvious to me is that somebody stabbed Josiah Lawson and people know who it was. And they don't want to say. Now, why don't they want to say? Hard to say why they don't want to say. You'd have to get them down and put battery cables on their thumbs and try to get them to talk. But as an example, 2 witnesses at the preliminary hearing and at the grand jury. No. A witness at the grand jury and a witness that was at both the preliminary and the grand jury. The one witness that was not at the preliminary that should have been was Angelica McFarland. And we always wondered why, out of the 4 girls that were there with Kyle Zoellner, only 3 testified. I don't know. I can't read minds, but I would guess that Angelica McFarland was not called at the preliminary hearing because her testimony doesn't back up the prosecution, doesn't help the prosecution. her testimony is also rough and varied. So I don't think the prosecution felt that she was a strong witness like the others were who said, yeah, I saw this, I saw this, I saw it. I think they thought Angelica was a little confused. But Angelica said she heard someone say, he's got a knife. She's down there somewhere, mayhem is breaking out, and she hears someone say, she doesn't know who, at least she
doesn't want to say.
Doesn't think she knows who. Doesn't say she knows who. Somebody says, he's got a knife. Jason Martinez, who was kind of the star witness at the preliminary hearing because he's the guy that they brought up to say, I saw Kyle Zoellner stab Josiah Lawson, and when he gets on the stand, he doesn't say that. He says, I didn't see anybody. But Jason Martinez said he heard someone say, he's got a knife. The reason I bring this up is because saying he's got a knife is very different than someone's been stabbed. You stabbed my friend. There are a lot of things being shouted, but he's got a knife can only be shouted by someone who's looking at someone with a knife. And it's a he. He's got a knife, or at least they think it's a he. Two different people heard somebody, or maybe two different people, say, he's got a knife. I want to know who that person is because they saw someone with a knife. Who did they see and what knife did they see and why haven't they testified or why haven't they come to the police and said, I saw somebody with a knife? Nobody has ever done that. And everybody who wants justice for Josiah or everybody who wants justice for Kyle Zoellner would love to know who had that knife, who saw it, who saw what happened and has not so far told anyone. So I kind of, as a journalist, I look at everybody possibly lying and I look at it like, well, maybe nobody's lying. You know, how does it look? How does the narrative read if nobody's lying? How does the narrative go if everyone's lying? And you just kind of keep going through it, trying to see if there's a convergence. That's kind of the journalistic method, I'd say. So somebody had a knife. Somebody stabbed Josiah Lawson about 6 times, and they aren't saying who it was. And there's a whole bunch of scenarios, I think, that could be spun out of that. So all I'm going to say in terms of concluding anything is that the basic scenarios are, Scenario 1, Kyle Zoellner stabbed Josiah Lawson. 2, somebody who was trying to defend Kyle Zoellner stabbed Josiah Lawson. 3, somebody who was trying to defend Josiah Lawson accidentally stabbed him. And 4, something else was going on. Somebody else wanted to kill Josiah Lawson for some reason we don't know.
The knife was tied to Zoellner, though, correct? He had a knife set that was in his car, and that the knife that was used was one of the knives, the only knife that was missing.
Absolutely not.
No.
Opposite is actually true. The knife that they found under the car was not one of Kyle Zoellner's knives and was not used in this catering kitchen. And they had the kitchen manager get on the stand under oath at the preliminary hearing and at the grand jury and say, I've never seen that knife before. That is not one of Kyle's knives. We don't really use those kind of knives in our kitchen. It's not a professional chef knife. Kyle's knives were Mac brand, Japanese style, professional, expensive knives. And the one that they found under the car was, I think the kitchen manager said something you could get at Bed Bath & Beyond or something, and would never use that in a kitchen. Now, I don't know about you, but I've spent some time in a kitchen. I've been a cook and a chef, and so I know what they're talking about. There's just knives you use and knives you don't. You don't use steak knives really for preparing food. So there is actually no link between the knife they found under the car and Kyle Zoellner, except for DNA evidence. And DNA evidence, and that's one of the things in Tales from the Grand Jury that I went into, just trying to figure out what these squints are talking about when they talk about DNA evidence. And it's like, so there was blood tests, and there were fiber tests, and there were fingerprint tests, and there was DNA tests, and they're all different, and they all take different texts, and they all look at different things. The knife that was found under the car, I'm not even going to call it the murder weapon because I'm not sure that it was the murder weapon, and there was no one who got up in front of the grand jury and said, this is the murder weapon. They all equivocated. Well, it could be. It's a good chance. But we don't know. And you can't tell from the autopsy. So the knife had no fingerprints to match Kyle Zoellner. The knife had no blood to match Kyle Zoellner. But the knife had DNA on it. DNA can come from, as the squints told the grand jury, it can come from sweat, blood, snot. You've got Kyle Zoellner, obviously beat up, bleeding, oozing, spitting. And then not only do you have all these different ways that DNA can get on something that has nothing to do with stabbing anybody, you can also transfer DNA. If you touch somebody's blood, snot, sweat, tears, and touch the item. So as one of the DNA techs told the grand jury, if this knife is near the scene, if the knife is near the scene and it gets some stuff on it, it can have DNA on it even if nobody ever used it. So for them to say, well, this knife that was under the Mustang wasn't just there. It wasn't just from a barbecue they had the day before and it got left in the grass. It's the murder weapon is something that the techs just couldn't conclude.
Now, I thought that I had read, it might have been a Lost Coast Outpost story on it, that in Zoellner's car, there was a knife set, I believe of 6 knives maybe, and one of those knives was missing, and that was a point of contention, was that police didn't lock down his vehicle at the scene of the crime. They let somebody drive it back to his house. I believe it was his girlfriend at the time.
So what happened was Kyle was arrested. So somebody had to drive his car home. And the neighbors were complaining about all the cars in the driveway. And they were actually complaining that, can somebody move this car? So Angelica McFarland's mother arrives on the scene. And she's freaking, she's like, I think she did pretty good, but she was like, what's going on at my daughter's first college party? What the heck? So Maria McFarland, Angelica's mom, offers to move the car because they're trying to get him out. The police okay it. She moves the car onto Spear, and then later they're trying to take all the girls home. So Angelica McFarland's dad takes somebody home. Kyle Zoellner's dad is taking people home, and Angelica's mom takes some people home. She takes Casey Gleaton home in Kyle's car, fully approved by the police. What happened was, when Casey was interviewed by the detectives, she said, I got up the next morning, I'm sleeping on the couch, I had a really bad night. I'm throwing up. I'm all traumatized. And Kyle's dad comes with Leela to the apartment. This is early Saturday morning, the morning after. And Leela's freaking out. She's like, I gotta know. And so she runs out and she gets into Kyle's Subaru and she pulls out this knife bag. And she's looking through the knife bag. She goes, I think one's missing. So that interview, as far as I can tell from reading all this stuff, that interview got the police thinking, we got to go and do another search of that apartment and find this bag, which they did. So they found the bag. They took the bag in for various forensic analysis. They looked through the bag, and Kyle had 4 knives in it, but there were only 3 that they could see. So this again said, where's the 4th knife? Okay, this feeds the narrative that Casey Gleaton had given, that a knife is missing. Kyle is like, I have 3 knives. I'm a little hazy on this. It's confusing, right? But the main thing I wanted to mention was that Kyle says there's a pocket with this paring knife in it. You have to pull the Velcro to get to it. So you open the knife case and you see a certain number of knives, but it's kind of almost like a hidden little pocket down in there. You open this thing up and there's the paring knife. So the detectives went back. This is during the preliminary hearing, and they go and in fact they find that knife that was supposedly missing.
So all the knives are accounted for?
All the knives are accounted for. And none of them match the knife that was found under the Mustang. Later, Leila Ortega gets in front of the grand jury and says, I wasn't worried about a knife. I didn't panic about a knife. I didn't go looking for a knife. The knife bag was in the house the whole time. So she tells a completely different story than Casey Gleaton did about this concern over was a knife missing. But the fact is that all of his knives were accounted for.
Had the police at the time searched his car?
At the time? At what time?
At the time that they arrest him?
No. So they arrested him. The police...
I mean, this is another point of contention, is the Arcata Police's response to the whole scene.
You know, the Arcata Police were over their heads, okay? And I think everybody agrees with that, with the possible exception of Tom Chapman, who's long gone. But he was the police chief at the time. But the National Police Foundation and a couple of different lawsuits have determined that Arcata Police were over their head. They had a crime scene that they had never dreamed of in their wildest dreams. 3 cops at 3 a.m. trying to control 50 to 100 people who are going nuts. So what happened was they arrive at the scene. Some people say, that's the guy who did it. And so one of the cops puts him in the car, puts Kyle Zoellner in his car. That cop kind of has a job of keeping an eye on the suspect, as well as interviewing people. And he's out in the street on Spirit trying to interview people who are all leaving. There was some people who stuck around to tell a story, but a lot of people were running, you know. It's like the cops are here, I'm out of here. There's a mayhem going on where Josiah Lawson is bleeding to death up in this cul-de-sac. You've got people doing CPR. You've got an ambulance trying to get in there. You've got people who are yelling and screaming, hysterical. There are people who are also hostile toward the police, saying, why didn't you do anything? Why'd you take so long? So the police are like trying to sort of contain the crime scene, right? And so they have this very tumultuous period of about 15 minutes where finally the ambulance gets in. Josiah Lawson is finally loaded on and taken off to Mad River Hospital. And then they start putting up crime scene tape. They start finding their, go get your crime scene tape, and they're borrowing it from the sheriff, and they're trying to contain the crime scene. Now, if you're a fan of cop shows or whatever, you're always watching some kind of urban police department throwing up a crime scene within seconds, and they got the booties on and they got the little numbers for everything. And no way. This is like, oh my God. So the 2 cops that are left are trying to put up the crime scene tape. They find this knife, they bag it, they're taking pictures. It's 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to take pictures of the blood pools and whatever, trying to get statements from witnesses. People are leaving. There's a famous video. We think it's famous. It's embedded in our second story. maybe the first story. I call it the mystery witness. So the cop that has Kyle detained in his car is standing there, and he's interviewing Paris Wright, who is one of the key witnesses for eventually for the prosecution. And this kid walks up to him and says, "Excuse me, sir, but the guy who assaulted him, he went off that way." And the cop says, "We got him in the car." And the kid is like, okay. And he turns around and he walks away, kind of like, "Oh, well, I tried." Now, I think I know who that kid is. He has never been identified. In fact, years after, I think timing-wise, after the grand jury declined to indict, the police department put out a press release, and it was carried on the news stations and in the papers or whatever, saying, "There are witnesses at the party we're trying to find. Here are some stills that we took from videos of some of the witnesses we're trying to find." And the kid who said, "Hey, I think he ran off that way," is standing there in one of these stills. The police were trying to identify him 2 or 3 years later by putting his picture out for the public. So we think we know who he is, but so far we haven't been able to contact. Whether he has anything to say, we don't know. He could say, "Well, what I was going to tell the police officer was, I heard this guy ran off down the street." Or he might tell the cop, he might say, "What I was going to tell the cop was, I was standing there and the guy stabbed him and he ran away." We don't know what he was going to say. But the policeman that was interviewing Paris Wright was busy. He thought he had the suspect. He thought he had the primary eyewitness. And when some kid walks up saying, maybe I think he went there, he just didn't want to hear it. Kind of over their heads. The APD were over their heads. They didn't have the staff. They didn't have the expertise in handling a homicide, I think. And the other law enforcement, like say sheriff, way more experience in homicides. And they, as far as I can tell, in doing the reading through the National Police Foundation, whatever, they said, "We'll help." And there seemed to be some turf thing, some institutional thing
between the sheriff's office and PD.
And it seemed like the APD just kind of held everyone else at arm's distance. I mean, at the scene, University Police showed up, sheriff showed up, Highway Patrol showed up. They had all these law enforcement people showing up eventually. But to try to get those people under some kind of command staff and tasking them with different things, pretty hard to do. So the sheriffs are standing around, the CHP are standing around while these 3 cops are trying to manage everything. And then they just kind of like leave. Because there wasn't anybody who could stand up and say, "Okay, CHP, I need you to do this. Sheriff, I need you to do this. UPD, you need to do this." They just didn't have that person. And I'm not criticizing anybody because, by God, I wouldn't be able to do it. But clearly they were underwater that night. And so a lot of evidence might have gotten missed.
When you say we think we know who this guy is that said the killer ran off in this direction, do you believe that law enforcement knows that individual?
They might. The part of the problem in covering this story is that law enforcement's taking the tack that it's an ongoing investigation. We can't talk about anything. We can't talk about anything. It's an ongoing investigation. So we don't know what they know. We've got snippets of what they know. They've testified under oath. Cops and detectives testified under oath saying, "I took this report," or I did this. And we also have their video cams from that night and some other interviews on video. that they did in the early hours of this investigation with various witnesses. So we kind of have some idea of what they were doing, but you just don't know who they interviewed that we don't know. Like, we didn't know about Marysville Mom until the grand jury transcripts got in my hands.
I didn't know about
7
her
years
or
later.
Arcata Dad until I read part 5 of your work.
Yeah, so we don't know. And that's why second guessing the cops, I mean, I'm not going to do it because I don't know what they know and don't know. My frustration is I'm asking what I consider to be maybe some generic kind of questions. Like, gee, how does that grand jury thing work? Why is it that I can't get the autopsy because you say what about the autopsy would possibly hurt an ongoing investigation? I can't get any answers to those questions. So I can't represent what they're thinking. But it's frustrating as a journalist to be told, you not only can't have that, but we're not even going to tell you why. And we're probably not ever going to talk to you again if you try.
Just to be stonewalled.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's just a competency issue, but you would think that if you're an officer and someone comes up to you and says, hey, I think this guy's running away, you would assume that you would maybe just even at a base level walk him over to the car and see if he could ID the individual that you have in custody as the one that he believes did it.
You would do that maybe in hindsight.
It's 2:30, by the way. I didn't know if you have a heart out or.
I have to leave soon.
Okay.
But I've lost my train of thought.
Competency of police officer walking an individual over to the car to ID Zoellner.
I'm sorry.
It'll come back. That was my bad.
What's your question?
Well, I mean, the context is important. This is a police department who has probably rarely, if ever, dealt with something at this scale. I mean, small town. I don't think it'd be unreasonable to assume understaffed, maybe undertrained, and they're thrust into this situation.
Yes, and if I may say so, the way that this homicide differs from other homicides, because there are homicides all the time here in Humboldt, thankfully not that many, but there are trials and preliminary hearings and arraignments, and there's all kinds of bad stuff happening. But this particular one got picked up by a community that wanted to make it a hate crime. And if they think that if anyone who hears me say this thinks I'm being insensitive, I apologize for that. I'm generally not insensitive. But let's call a hate crime when it's a hate crime. And the irony is, no one in this community is more hated than Kyle Zoellner. Ironically, he has never left the community. He doesn't plan to leave the community. He's working on kind of getting his life back. This has taken several years out of his life to get up the psychological courage to raise his head, to talk to the press, and to go out and try to do something that he thinks is positive. He's actually studying now to be an EMT, of all things. There's a lot of hate towards him. He feels it every day. And that's super ironic from people who say, we don't believe in hate. No to hate. Say no to hate. And I say, everyone listen to that. Everyone say no to hate. Everyone say no to prejudice. Can we talk? Can we get along? Can we discuss without everybody getting into a fist fight? And so I welcome anybody who wants to talk about this, who's got maybe some evidence. The problem is we got way more, like anything else, we got way more theories than we have evidence. So I'm not real interested in theories. What I am interested in is what people have as evidence, what they've seen, what they've documented. And, we heard, one of the things we heard years ago was that someone was offering the Lawson family a video. It was in the papers that a video is going to surface that's going to show the truth. And Charmaine Lawson was very hopeful that this is going to come forward. And it never did. At least they stopped talking about it. And I've never seen it. And I don't know what became of it. So evidence would be good. But as time goes by, and anyone who covers homicides knows, this is not an ongoing investigation. This is a cold case. And it's not going to be solved. Unless, some miracle happens and somebody who has ironclad evidence finally decides to come forward. And I think we also, as a community, have to ask ourselves, why do people feel intimidated or reluctant about telling the truth about this? What was going on that night that people are afraid to talk about it? That bothers me.
Well, and that is a crazy part of this story, is that there were so many people there that you would be hard-pressed to believe that nobody really saw what happened.
It's possible
That nobody saw.
that nobody saw. I would say, I want to talk to the person who said he's got a knife. We have it on 2 witnesses that was said by somebody. So I think it's also possible that somebody does know.
What do you think their motivations would be in not coming forward?
What do you think? Why would you not come forward?
Well, I mean, if there were drugs and you were under the influence, or you had been participating in something that might paint you in a bad light if you were to go to the police, I could see that having an effect. But also, somebody died. And you would think that morality would come into play there, and you would feel obligated to say something.
Yeah. Well, one thing I thought was that if you saw Kyle Zoellner stab Josiah Lawson and you came forward, you would not have to worry. Kyle Zoellner is not going to come after you. He's just a guy, right? He's just a kid. He's actually now almost 30. But there's no danger. There's no danger to anyone if you saw Kyle Zoellner stab somebody to come forward and say that. Nobody did. Paris Wright didn't say it. Jason Martinez didn't say it. Nobody. Keandre Clark didn't say it. Nobody said, I saw Kyle Zoellner stab Josiah Lawson. They all say, in fact, I didn't see it. If you saw Kyle do it, imagine Paris Wright. Paris Wright could say, yeah, I saw him do it. And Kyle's going to trial like that. And Paris Wright can later say, oh, I was confused. At any time, Kyle could have gone to trial because somebody said, yeah, I saw him do it. And they didn't. If it wasn't Kyle, if it was somebody else, maybe you have reason to be afraid to say so.
Believing that individual, obviously still being out there, could come for you in some way.
That makes sense to me. You do have a possibility that if it was somebody else that's willing to kill Josiah Lawson, they're going to be willing to kill you too. That's just speculation. But to me, that's a more likely theory than the idea that I'm afraid to say the truth because Kyle Zoellner's coming after me.
How much do you think that the race politics at the time played into all of the confusion around this case? Because obviously you do have a white individual and a black individual, and the black individual is dead. And this is 2017. I mean, we're pre-George Floyd, but BLM has obviously been building at this time. Racial tensions are on the rise.
Right. We just had Trump inaugurated in January of 2017, and riots broke out, Portland, whatever. So, I mean, that was hugely part of it, I think. That when you're in the community and you've seen a history of police not taking you seriously or actually being against you, it would be easy to pick that narrative up and say, well, the Arcata police are just like all those other cracker police departments, and they don't have our interests in mind. They don't have our community in mind. They're actually out to hurt us, and this is just another case of it. I don't blame people for feeling that. My question is that what happened? And I don't see any evidence that there was racial motivation in what happened to Josiah Lawson, unless there's somebody else out there, scenario 4, that we just don't know about.
Yeah, it's tricky. And it's almost hard to believe that it's been going on for so long. And we're still pretty much in the dark.
Yeah. And so this is, once you kind of get into this story, I think you get a little hooked, and I haven't taken the attitude that I'm going to try to solve this. I don't think it's my job. I'm a journalist. I don't solve crimes for the police. But if I could create a channel, some public awareness, and through that something comes forward that the police could use, well, it might be good.
So if you were to take off your journalist hat and just put on a speculative hat, you think that scenario 4 is the most likely, that there is some other individual who is not yet named that was involved?
That would explain all the evidence that I've seen best.
Wow. Well, I know you got to get out of here. We'll have to pick this up on the second part because there's more I want to talk to you about. But I think it's important, the work that you're doing covering that story, because it seems like people have made up their mind and they're not interested. Either way, whether you think Zoellner did it or didn't do it, it seems like the story has kind of fallen off and nobody's actually interested in digging a little deeper to figure out what really happened that night.
Yeah, so we're staying at it. We'll see what happens. I don't know if there's any more stories. I'm working on something completely different now for the Humboldt SAG. But I appreciate your support, and I welcome anybody to have a talk about it. Why not?
Do you want to plug all your stuff, the Catholic Farmer, the Humboldt SAG, where people can find the rest of your work?
Sure. I got the HumboldtZag.substack.com, which is the local stories that you don't hear. I have truthsmack.substack.com, which is a journalist approach to controversial conspiracy theory type stuff. And the Catholic Farmer, which is abufrancis.substack.com, which is the intersection of sustainability and spirituality. Let's save the planet, folks, while we still can. And that's it.
Okay, well, thanks for doing this, Steve. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, good. Thank you.